Hello, everybody. I'm Athura Mathur, the Director of Legal Research at the Center for Art Law, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our Art Law Colloquium on Cultural Integration, Immigrants' Art Participation and Contribution. Now, before I introduce our wonderful speaker for today, and as per usual, let me let you know a little bit about the Center for Art Law and about what we do. We are a Brooklyn-based research and education nonprofit, and we are dedicated to offering resources and programming to advance the arts and law community. Through our website, our newsletter, our events, we disseminate information and we try to keep our audience updated on everything art law, news, cases, publications, movies, and a lot more. We also facilitate tons of conversations by hosting and participating in programs such as ours today. And of course, this doesn't even begin to describe everything that we do, so we invite you to subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already to receive updates. We would also ask you to consider becoming a premium member with the center to receive tons of offers and discounts for our events, as well as access to our case law corner, our articles, and the recordings of our past events. I'm really excited to announce a ton of our upcoming events, including our 2023 Art Law Conference happening next week, both in person and online. We'll be covering artificial intelligence, copyright, commission agreements, contracts, anti-money laundering, sanctions, and a lot more. We also have a colloquium by Edward Lee on NFTs and an event on DAOs and the art market coming up in May as well. These are all available on our website, so you can check out the information and hopefully register for all of them. We would love to see more of you. A few of the usual housekeeping items for today. The program is being recorded for archival purposes, but as I mentioned, we'd love to see you. So please feel free to keep your cameras on, but your microphones muted for the time being. Once the recording of the session is available, we'll send that across to you along with materials and a survey for the event. And if you have any questions for our speaker, we will have a question and answer session later. So please put them in the chat box below. We would encourage your participation, and we just love to hear from the audience. Now, finally, coming to our presentation for today, we have Jennifer Novak-Leonard, professor, academic, and author of Considering Cultural Integration in the United States, Empirical Essays on Immigrants, Arts, and Participation. Professor Leonard focuses her work on the social roles of arts, artists, and creativity, how they impact people and communities, and the implication for policy and practice. She specializes in the development and the use of novel measurement systems to understand cultural participation and the personal and public values derived from these experiences to inform multiple domains of public and social policy. You can read more about Professor Novak-Leonard in her full bio, which will be sent across shortly along with the handout and materials for today's session. But without any further ado, we're so excited to have you, and I will hand it over to Jennifer right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, for being part of this conversation. I'm very much looking forward to do this, the opportunity to share my work and to engage in questions with you. Just one moment, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Great. So as already mentioned, Jennifer Novak-Leonard. I'm a research associate professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I also served as the research director of the Arts Impact Initiative housed within the College of Fine and Applied Arts there, which really focuses on the publicly engaged understanding of arts and what they mean to people broadly written communities. And I also serve as a research director of the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project that goes by SNAP, which is a national survey of arts and design alumni to really understand also education. So, in that summary, it kind of gives you the overview as I work very closely, really focus on the roles of art. And I use that quite broadly when I say that in terms of various forms of creative expression, artists and the creators of those endeavors, and a various range of creative practices. I try to think about the ways in which these impact individuals, kind of pro-social behaviors, and our communities defined by our identities, our networks, or in terms of geographic definitions, and what the actual meaning of these endeavors are for communities and for people. So really trying to understand what is the meaning and how do we think about becoming more effective and efficient with our practices, both in a professional or a management setting, but also thinking systemically in terms of policy. So I am a social scientist, and you'll hear that coming through. I do not have any law experience. So I appreciate the opportunity to engage in this conversation with so many of you who have that expertise. So I'm a social science rooted. I use a broad range of methods, qualitative and quantitative, and you'll see that in the conversation today. A lot of my work is publicly engaged, so I partner deeply with cultural or community development practitioners or policy leaders to really think about what are some of the pressing questions that we need and problems and questions that are currently happening that we need data informed decisions. So that really underlies a lot of the work that I do. And then that comes along with that translation between more scholarly research and what does that mean in terms of the translation into practice. That's kind of where I'm coming from. It's very social science rooted, a very data driven, but with that notion of what is the qualitative work that underlies that, and thinking very much about what does that mean in terms of creative activity, the individuals who engage in that creative activity, and what does that mean for individuals in our communities in policy conversation. So just a bit about who I am, kind of how I'm entering this conversation. So during the time today, I want to talk a bit about kind of what is the motivation that underlies the work of looking at cultural integration in the United States? What do we understand and are thinking about from a policy perspective in this regard? And then I'd like to shift into sharing some of my research, and I really focus that around kind of two primary topics. The first being investigating what does arts participation mean as a potential means for assisting immigrants' cultural integration into the United States. And secondly, some further consideration and reflection on what arts participation is. And I'll pull in a few different studies that I've undertaken and published that speak to both of these points, and then certainly some closing thoughts. And as I proceed, please drop in questions into the chat. We'll do our best to either respond to them at that time if it's germane to that current conversation, or hold them to the end. But I very much encourage your questions and comments. So let's get started in terms of the motivation here. So, this is not new news to anyone, this conversation or broadly writ, but immigration is a key aspect of American history, the identity, and what our future is, right? There's now a little bit of an outdated quote, but from former President Obama, the basic idea of welcoming immigrants to our shores is central to our life and our DNA. It's who we identify as, and broadly in terms of the U.S. as a nation and as society. But we have a lot of questions about how immigrants, despite our focus on immigration, are actually settling into what we're considering American society. And there have been unprecedented changes in immigration patterns over recent years. And this is now raising significant concerns that the mechanisms for facilitating immigration are not well suited, that there's some antiquated thinking and not well suited to what our current situation is and the projected situation, trends are in terms of incoming immigrant populations. So while this has always been germane, we really have some challenges and some questions about how we're assisting and understanding integration and success of immigrants within the US. So I'd like to unpack this a little bit as we proceed and take a look at some of these immigration patterns are. So first and foremost, and this data comes from others who are doing population projections, is that we're facing a record-breaking population share of first-generation immigrants. So if you're, the purple bars here represent the absolute count in terms of foreign born, and I'm using some of the language that comes from the Census Bureau, some of the terminology there. And so we might hold some of the conversations around what we think about some of those terms, but I'm really utilizing some of the terminology that comes from our federal statistics that underlie this work. So foreign-born, the absolute count of foreign-born individuals, and if you look at this green line, this indicates the percentage of the U.S. population comprised of first-born individuals. So in terms of kind of our massive waves of immigration, towards the end of the 19th century. Those are the historic highs. But we are, if you're looking at that 14.8%, we are just about to hit and surpass that based on these population projections. The latest stats that I've been seeing really indicate 2030, which seems like it's just around the corner, that we'll be surpassing this historic high in terms of the composition of firstborn immigrants residing in the US. Now, that paired with declines in fertility rate and some other social dynamics, this immigration, not in and of itself, but will actually, due to the number, but as a shift in kind of that whole demographic pie, if you're thinking about it, will actually be the primary driver of population growth in the US. So there's some considerations there. Oh, there we are. That's where we're about to project it to surpass the historic high. Additionally, in addition to first generation immigrants share in the population, we're also about to kind of approach a record breaking share of the population being comprised of second generation immigrants. So these are the children of first generation immigrants. Typically, the definition is usually just at least one parent is foreign born. And so you see here just kind of the rate of it's not the rate, but the actual percentage increase. And so we're really approaching almost about 14% of the population being second generation immigrants. So if you're looking at 20, and that kind of pairs almost, in parallel with that rise of the share of the population being comprised of first generation. So we have this kind of simultaneous record breaking. We're on the forefront of really approaching these historic highs. In addition to kind of the size of the population for these projections, we're thinking about the composition. Much of our thinking is based on kind of what the composition was in the earlier part of kind of our history of immigration. These stats here go back to 1960. But if you're looking at the leftmost column, this orangish color here, predominantly we had European immigrants. And many of us are familiar with this history. But over time, that portion of immigrant populations living in the US has shrunk, and it's increased notably in terms of individuals coming from Latin America, as well as individuals immigrating from Asia. And we're also seeing some rises in terms of individuals coming from Africa. So while we had some thinking about the notion of who was an immigrant, and I'm speaking in very broad strokes here of who was comprising that share, that's very much shifted. And so there's an increasing notion of, while it's always been, the population's never been homogeneous, we have an increasing notion of heterogeneity in terms of who comprises that immigrant population. So that notion, that kind of the historic kind of theory in terms of how our individuals how do they become settled when they enter the US, was really kind of based on that notion of kind of smaller, of that more homogeneous population. There's a notion of assimilation theory, really based on if you come and learn the language, learn some of the kind of social norms and ways of operating. Once you kind of acquire that, to become comfortable with that helps develop your social capital, and then becomes kind of structural assimilation, meaning social mobility in terms of jobs, in terms of education. And it was almost thought of as almost kind of a linear progression. You do step one, then you are able to achieve step two and step three. And it very much relied on labor market dynamics for that idea of social upward mobility. And others have written extensively about this theory. But with these shifts in patterns, there's very much a consensus that this is kind of an antiquated way of thinking. And so that notion is inadequate in terms of that single kind of classical model or theory of how individuals become settled into kind of American society, if we can use that term broadly. But really thinking about now this notion of integration, for which there's very much a push for really developing strategies to assist in this process, and very much thinking about how do we help facilitate becoming settled, social mobility, comfort, and a quality of life for individuals, of thinking about how do you bring together both in terms of adapting to American society in terms of language, economic well-being, but also holding on to individuals' identity, cultural norms, meaning, and values from their country of origin. So really the notion of integration is how do you kind of hold on to both and bring them together in a meaningful way for the individual and their success of them and their families. If you haven't seen it, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, this is kind of the biggest piece that has gone out in recent years in 2015, kind of really took stock of kind of the state of the knowledge. And this covers a broad range of economic well-being, social conditions, education, a very broad take on this notion of integration, kind of what's known to support it in some of the theories and ways of working to assist in the development of strategies to adopt these notions of integration. And cultural integration is a prominent piece, but it's primarily focused on notions of linguistic adaptation and success in the US. And in this report, they recognize the role of creative expression and artistic creation of what it might be able to do in terms of assistance with integration and facilitating opportunities for individuals when they come to the US, but very little is known about what that means, how it could operate, and overall the potential of it from a data perspective in terms of understanding that role of cultural and artistic creativity in this notion of integration. So it's flagged as a prominent opportunity, but very little is known about it. And that really kind of is what motivates a lot of my research to see how can we start to better fill in that gap of knowledge to assist and better understand creative expression and artistic activity with this assistance and the notion of a cultural integration for individuals when they come to the US. So I'd like to, we're going to focus more now on this notion of arts participation, broadly writ, and what it means potentially for cultural integration and individual success and kind of settlement. So when we think about arts participation, we broadly understand that it's seen as positive, that an individual is engaging in creative activity, attending music concerts, going to a museum of various sorts, writing themselves, painting themselves, that is seen as a positive activity. And many others have written about this in terms of the ways that it's seen as positive. And in particular, pardon. And this comes from a colleague, Alan Brown, and this is a little small, but this just gives I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but just to give you kind of a broad accounting of the many ways that it's seen as positive. If we're looking here at the x-axis, this kind of outlines thing about where do these benefits and these kind of positive things accrue. Starting from an individual, thinking about interpersonal and pro-social behaviors and expanding outward to a broader community. And on the y-axis, it might be things that happen to an individual while they're directly engaged in the activity, while they're dancing, while they're painting, while they're sewing, while they're creating or experiencing an event, maybe something that happens before or after the event, and also some notions at the utmost there, some cumulative. This is very theoretical in terms of how we get benefits from arts and creative engagement, but they're all seen as positive. This notion of flow and captivation, how it helps our own personal well-being, expression of emotions and processing of trauma or different experiences that we may have, these notions of intellectual for the potential to learn and be exposed to new ideas, social bonding, how do we connect with people who are both similar to us to help perhaps celebrate heritage, or those who are different from us to help understand differences. And this kind of expands outward in terms of this notion of various ways of, we think of them as benefits from arts and cultural engagement. So that's really a very quick overview of just how we think about benefits of arts participation, how they recruit, and the notion of them being positive. So how does arts participation can enable some of these benefits through direct social interactions? We think about this from various kind of arts activities and events from a discursive means. And Mark Stern and Susan Seifert have written on this fairly extensively. And we think about discursive being that people gather to engage in exchange of ideas, maybe kind of similar to what we're doing today. It's kind of arts focused, but we're talking about a shared community where we can engage in conversation, bring diverse perspectives and opinions to the table to engage and exchange ideas. Also a notion of kind of ecological means. Thinking about, well, arts activities occur within social and institutional networks. provide connections to other parts of that. Maybe that notion of expanding kind of your social capital by meeting new people, being in new spaces, learning new ways of being, and exposure to new ideas. And also the notion of active participation, that the actual action of doing things, creating things, making things in and of itself is a means of civic engagement, due to the likelihood that engaging in such activities will actually lead to increased social capital and an expansion of, of social networks. Additionally, when we think about from this perspective of how is arts participation played its cultural integration notion, that arts participation can enable this notion of kind of the dual cultural identities. I've spoken on this a little bit, and this notion of multiculturalism. How can an individual bring together kind of the best of both worlds or their multiple worlds, and to really help to bring that together to help fuel their creativity or to fuel their drive. And a number of individuals have written about this in terms of the second generation advantage of actually thinking about individuals who kind of harness their multiple experiences to actually foster their creativity and creative expression. These are just kind of the theoretical ways that we think about that role of arts participation as a means of civic engagement and cultural integration. So now I'd like to turn to, so that's kind of what underlies some of the thinking in this work. But then the big question is kind of, what do we know about this? What kind of data of an empirical basis do we have to actually kind of test some of these ideas or to really help inform and refine them as we go along through this learning? So now I'd like to turn to kind of how do we actually investigate what we know about this notion of arts participation, and thinking about its potential for immigrants' cultural integration. So the primary source that we have available to us in the US is the Survey of Public Participation in the Arts. It's a national survey. It's sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts. It's piggybacked onto the current population survey, which is run by the US Census Bureau. And so it's a general population survey of adults age 18 and older. And it's been conducted approximately every 5 years since 1982. And it covers a broad range of activity. It primarily asks questions about, what did you do during the prior 12 months? And it asks a whole range of questions about kind of, did you attend a particular kind of performance? For example, did you attend a jazz performance in the last 12 months? Yes or no? Did you do any creative activity? Or any creative writing, such as fiction or nonfiction? Yes or no? And it has a whole range of activities that an individual is asked. Including digital access, reading, writing, painting, active work, as well as kind of attendance and various means of digital engagement. I had already mentioned that's piggyback on the current population survey. And we're able to really look at this in terms of immigrant populations since 2002, because that's when the current population survey started asking a series of questions that actually allow us to be able to identify first generation immigrants or second generation immigrants and third plus generation immigrants, and some other facets to be able to kind of better specify the immigrant population. And certainly we already know that there's much more greater notion of heterogeneity with this. There's certainly limitations in terms of the data, in terms of how granular it can get in terms of populations. But this gives us a really broad picture in terms of some of the dynamics. So I'm going to use the 2012 data to underlie some of the analyses that I'm going to show you now. And certainly we've already flagged here that while the FPPA, the Survey of Public Participation, that's a broad, I think it's approximately 100 questions about a range of artistic and creative activity. It came from a notion in the 80s, really a focus on the health of nonprofits, which at that time really stemmed from a Western European artistic tradition. So there's a bit of inertia in there that's been flagged in some of my other writing, as well as others, in terms of some of the emphasis. So I just want to flag that in terms of some of the limitations of the questions that are available. So this is small, I get it, but we're going to look at this in kind of a high level. So what you're seeing here is that to the right and at the top there, kind of that reddish color, is where we see that individuals who are US born are participating in arts activities at a higher rate than those who are foreign born. And down there at the blue, when it extends To the left and in that blue, it means that individuals who are first generation immigrants are participating in higher rates. So variance off of that center line means higher rates. And as we already see here, first generation immigrants are participating at higher rates or even on par, so really close to that center line at relatively few of these measures that are available out of this almost 100. So we see they're participating at lower rates, statistically significant differences there. There are a few exceptions, and what those specific exceptions are really focus. Here's a list of kind of they use the internet to watch or access modern ballet or contemporary dance performances or other dance performances. But what we see here in this list of activity, two primary domains where we see first generation immigrants participating at higher rates. That's really focused on dance as well as focusing on Latin, Spanish, and salsa music. So we do see some differences there in terms of kind of genre and form of how people are into participating. So this looks at second generation immigrants, and our examination here, we're really thinking about some of that notion of is there a second generation advantage, and are they participating at higher rates than perhaps their parents, the first generation immigrants here. And what we see here is that they actually are participating at higher rates, even higher than third generation. So that kind of middle line there, where they're anchored off to is the second generation immigrants, and we're comparing the blue and the red here. But what we really see is that overall second generation immigrants reporting at higher rates than first generation, and even higher in some select activities than what we're considering third plus generation immigrants. So that gives us, while not an explanatory notion of the second generation, does give us some empirical basis. There's something to explore there. So to really kind of suss out in even further detail this notion and the idea of second generation advantage, there's a series of kind of regressions, which really dives into greater depth. So we're not just saying that an individual's immigrant generation is the defining factor, but we know obviously income and there are many other influential variables, their level of educational attainment, their parents' educational attainment, kind of an indicator of potential social mobility. There's also theory about exposure as a child to various types of arts and creative activities, gender, whether one is married, a whole host of socio-demographic characteristics. And additionally, kind of leisure time. How much time does an individual kind of outside of work and outside of home and childcare and other responsibilities does one have to potentially engage? And also that notion of mobility in terms of, is there some indication that the second generation individual has some social mobility from first generation in terms, and here it's used as a kind of a control variable in terms of their educational attainment. So what do we find? Is there additional evidence? So these are the results of the regression, and we found there is evidence, so controlling for all those other factors that might influence one's experience and whether or not they engage, that there is some evidence of that second generation advantage. But very specifically, if thinking about owning art, actual visual and material art pieces, engaging in social dance practices, and attending live music. So there's more thinking to be done in terms of maybe why these particular activities might be of particular either attraction or where we see individuals with that in terms of acquisition, interest, and kind of further on trying to unpack kind of why these particular activities are popping up in terms of indications of that second generation advantage. So the analyses that I've shown to you thus far have relied on that national survey, that survey of public participation in the arts. I've actually already flagged for you some considerations around kind of what is contained within that particular survey. It's the preeminent one that we have to work with in the US, so there's a ton to learn from it. But there certainly are some considerations around what's in and kind of what's out in terms of what it measures and its ability to reflect the types of creative activity that we might be interested in better understanding, particularly when we're looking and thinking about immigrant populations. So I just want to show you very quickly. So this is kind of a historical look at some of the statistics that have been reported from that SPPA, which by and large, when they were initially looking and publishing on this, was a great focus on attendance-based activities. So for example, did you attend a ballet performance the past 12 months? Did you attend a classical music performance the past 12 months? And they would kind of aggregate that up and issue a statistic that was considered our attendance at benchmark arts activities. Um, and that was really that key statistic for many decades, really drove a great deal of policy discourse in terms of the arts investment. That was kind of the single indicator that was commonly used to drive what was happening. And while this image, doesn't show the difference terribly much, but really this notion of decline was dominant in policy discourse. So it was a really kind of a deficit-based purview in terms of arts participation and saying, hey, people in the US aren't doing these things, couched with this indicator of decline. But we've done a lot of, but despite this, and meanwhile, we're thinking about all the ways that technology has opened up our ability to create, to share, to do, and engage in things, in addition to all the many ways that people have been creating over time. And then we're thinking about the many different forms that we're thinking about immigrant populations and the growing diversity in the US and the many different voices and creative forms that we're thinking about. So this number was really not jiving with what our lived experiences were. So I and a number of others have really thinking about, okay, how can we take a look at what's being measured in that national survey to really aim to better capture kind of what is happening around us and in the world. So with a study, and particularly, I worked with immigrant populations. I'm based in Chicago, here in Chicago with Chinese immigrants based here in the city. So did a series of interviews with individuals kind of living in and working in our local Chinatown to really test kind of what are your experiences? How do you engage in creative activity juxtaposed against these kind of standard measures that are being used in the survey? And so what we found is that there certainly is a gap between what people report on this survey as arts participation and the reality of what they were doing. And so what kind of accounts and how can we best describe the gap that we were able to identify through this interviewing process is that first, there was a significant ambiguity about what kind of qualifies or people kind of judging what they do as whether or not that would qualify as a response to the survey. From our interviewees, about a third of them asked, would you count this or does this count? So really giving us an indication that perhaps some of that Western European kind of inertia that stemmed from the survey or this notion or the language around arts might be either off-putting or create a gap between individuals' experiences of how they're creating and expressing themselves and this notion of either high art, if it's what am I doing actually qualifying. So there's a real gap there. We also found that individuals were omitting culturally specific practices. So if there was a tradition, a holiday, a festival of something that was very culturally rooted, they often omitted that. Particularly with the Chinese immigrants that we were speaking with, calligraphy came up a great deal. And many individuals discounted that as an activity that they would see as creatively expressive, even though they spoke about it in that manner as qualifying for the survey. So there's a great deal of consideration to be given here in terms of how do we understand from a policy perspective and value the creativity and cultural traditions and expression and activity that individuals are creating, particularly from immigrant populations. Alongside this was ambiguity around intention that individuals brought up. Must one explicitly be trying to express themselves through artistic means or seeking to consume another's artistic creative content for that activity to count? And this was also discussed in partnership or in pairing with the conversation around culturally specific practices. Individuals shared stories of engaging in either food traditions and food ways, festivals and costume making, and a broad range of things, and really strong questions about does that count in terms of creative and cultural activity. So we've got a ways to go here, but we're able to identify some of the things underlying key gaps. So I had the opportunity to work with a team to actually create and field a study in the state of California. Again, kind of a statewide survey of adults. We had the opportunity to think about how might we rephrase some of these questions in effort to have people kind of share this broad range of creative activity that they were doing. And we selected California because that's kind of a leading indicator of where the US population is going as a whole in terms of diversity, as well as terms of the share of their population that is comprised of the first and second generation immigrants. At the time that we fielded this study, approximately 30% was comprised of first generation immigrants. So it was a real kind of testing ground and opportunity to kind of see, can we do this and how might we do that? So in this practice, I opened the survey with, people are involved in different types of activities that they enjoy or that are important to them. Please tell us, please briefly tell me about any creative, cultural, or artistic activities that you do. And we were excited. I mean, certainly many people reported the types of activities that are also covered on our national survey, as we thought they might. But in addition to that, we got a tremendous amount of granularity in terms of celebrations of for Day of the Dead, in terms of other cultural traditions, cultural dance, cultural music, instruments that may be very specific to different immigrant populations. There was just a tremendous amount of detail and granularity that individuals shared. And we really kind of we used artistic, but we removed that word arts from our question and really tried to get that trifecta of creative, cultural, and artistic activities. So we're really excited about that. And kind of what does that look like when we kind of synthesize that and report it out? And so in contrast to that column chart that I showed previously of the survey and those declining rates of attendance at benchmark activities, this is a principal components analysis, so looking at the relationship of these different activities in terms of their space from each other, but really also showing the rates of a broad range of activity where we had some closed-ended questions. So really the point of this, I'm not going to go into all the detail of this, but really sees kind of a greater breadth. We also see higher rates of individuals reporting their engagement activities, and we're able to look at the greater breadth of what individuals are engaging in, including gardening for pleasure and for creative activity, sharing about artists, talking about artists, engaging in music. And as part of this kind of question process, not only do we ask, for example, did you engage in dance and music, but what did you do? And so this is just an example. I'm a dancer in my prior history, so I always love these examples of just what people used in their own terms, their own vernacular to describe the ways, the forms of dance that they happen to be engaged in when they work. So we see hip hop, we see club, we see freestyle, we see jazz, we see Zumba, we see salsa, we see merengue, which none of this granularity had previously been captured. So it really helps show the breadth and variation of what is meaningful to people and the ways in which they are engaging in creative activity. Also, in contrast, we see to kind of how that attendance-focused measure that we've utilized from the survey of public participation in the arts, we asked about frequency, really as an indicator to understand the centrality of some of these activities to individuals. And the point of this graph is to really show that we see many individuals engaging in a much greater frequency in terms of making and creating artistic activity and creative expression themselves, as opposed to going to events. Now, certainly that's limited by how often or frequently events are offered, but this really is an indicator that that notion of creating and that hands-on activity and individuals expressing themselves is really germane to many individuals, or at least we saw in the state of California. Now, despite that, we still see significant differences between individuals who had self-identified as immigrants in this survey and those who were native born. So here, this shows that we still see significant differences, even after controlling for a number of socio-demographic factors. There's significant difference in terms of the rates and the individuals are engaging in. Here we see some differences in terms of the rates of individuals kind of making visual art, engaging in DIY expression, making music, learning how to make art, doing craft work, creative writing, dancing. These are some of the key examples. as well as attendance, of whether or not they feel, are going to creative or cultural activities in buildings or in parks, going to movies, art exhibits. So this raises significant questions. And if we're able to capture this broader range of activity and understand creative expression, a deeper exploration of barriers that are standing between individuals and perhaps engage at the levels that we'd like to. So I want to so I've covered a broad range of kind of why are we thinking about arts participation as a potential means for cultural integration, how we've been able to understand arts participation, kind of given data and approaches that are available to us from a social science perspective, and also some ways we've been trying to innovate on what arts participation is and understanding kind of some of the variations there to really better capture the range of activities, and particularly for immigrant as well as other marginalized communities within that notion of broader, more cultural and more democratic understanding of creative and cultural activity. So why do we think about this? So when we're thinking about the potential role of cultural and creative activity, we're thinking about the many types of activities, opportunities, civic programs, entities like the Center for Art Law that are helping to support individuals, not only in the activities they want to do in and of themselves, but as part of a larger network of civic organizations, assisting with the connections that are helping immigrants to be settled in American society and for success and overall well-being. So we see that there's a tremendous potential for arts and cultural activities there with that. And I also encourage you who I think we'll be sharing a link in terms of Art Place America, also did a study of some very specific entities who are engaging in various types of social practices, as well as social services to assist with immigrant connections. They have some really nice case studies there. But we also want to think about how can we think about more democratic ways of investing, the value of creative and cultural activity wherever it is happening, how it's happening. So if we are not seeing activity that individuals are engaging in terms of some of these statistics, how do we do that to better ensure that investments and fostering is happening so all individuals have the opportunity to be invested in for resource allocation to reach their creative potential? And that's what we really want to think about. And if we harken back to that overview that I gave in terms of the benefits, we want to ensure and have a better understanding so that we can best optimize all individuals' abilities to capture these positive benefits, either at the individual level or if we're thinking about that intersocial or community defined level in terms of overall benefits for creative and cultural and artistic activity. And I just want to briefly close with, I and colleagues did a broad lit review of because of our understanding of what's some of the additional evidence base for understanding these benefits and the ways that individuals can engage. And so this covered a broad range of activity. But what we specifically see is that there is an increasing evidence base for that, the transmitting, reinforcing, and reimagining shared cultural identities, particularly for racial and ethnic minorities, refugees and immigrant populations. So there's a growing evidence base for that through cultural and creative activity to help support individuals, both in terms of their own well-being, as well as in terms of social mobility and social connections. So I'm going to pause there, and I've covered a lot of ground, but I'd love to answer any questions that maybe directly about these studies or some other things that are in these works. So thank you so much for being a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for such a fantastic presentation. The center, we haven't hosted a presentation like this, I think for a very, very long time. So this has been wonderful from a different perspective as well. So please, if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat, or we're a small enough group. So if you want to raise your hand and ask anything specifically, please feel free to. But thank you once again, Jennifer. A couple of questions that we do have to start us off. I think we are a little curious to know what inspired you to research in this area. What made you take up this research topic and conduct these studies?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it was really personal experiences and my social network and my personal experiences and seeing so much creative activity from friends and individuals who themselves were either a first generation immigrant or second generation immigrant, and just the breadth and wealth of activity that they as individuals were involved in. And it just wasn't, there was a giant disconnect between what I was seeing and experiencing and what was reflected in some of our stats and kind of national conversation around arts and creative activity. And so with the notion that so much policy is focused on kind of what is the empirical basis to help inform that, at the time that I entered this space, there was a real dearth of kind of quantitative and an empirical basis to be able to help inform that conversation. And so backing out from that, I really started engaging kind of like, how are we measuring that? And, oftentimes what's measured is treasured in many conversations, not exclusively, but certainly some of the policy conversations and discourse that I'm involved in. So if we're not measuring it and understanding it and able to examine it, it's hard to enter the space for broader policy consideration for investments. And I do approach it from a more democratic, I work toward to approach it to a more democratic perspective. And so really, how can we be more inclusive for the individuals who are living in the United States to really value the creative activity and to hopefully best invest in their potential, not only for themselves, but we see it to benefit kind of our communities, and we need to examine that more closely to better invest and to support that.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful answer to that question. Much appreciated. We do have another question that's come into the chat. It's interesting to hear about considering a more expansive definition of arts-based activities, such as gardening and consuming media, that may better represent how immigrant communities participate in the arts. So in your research into highlighting more forms of arts participation, did you at all have to settle on or define what is not arts participation?
Yes, and then the continues to be conversation and learning around this. And I will back up to say there was an extensive amount of qualitative research that underlined the creation of the survey. We were on the ground with an expansive team talking to individuals in different locations in California, in this case in particular, but really understanding, trying to elucidate what does an individual describe as, what do they see as creative, what kind of satisfies their own interest or desire in terms of that creative activity, and where do they apply that value. And so we heard a great deal about gardening and the curation of the gardens. We heard a great deal certainly about culinary endeavors, various traditions, be that different, activities for around celebrations. We heard that around parades. We heard that around customizing cars depending upon kind of where you are and kind of what was important to different things were important to different communities. We spoke with a great deal with Hmong community in California. So in that prior work, it was kind of, what did individuals tell us what was meaningful and what they see as artistic? Now, when you create a survey, you have to make choices. There's a limited amount of kind of real estate on a survey and time and attention. So absolutely choices need to be made. We attempted to pair that with open ends to really kind of capture that. And I will say, and some of the phrasing, we backed away from genre specific questions. So we didn't ask those questions like, did you do ballet or did you do particular, rock and roll? I asked like, what do you do with music? And then tell us about what that is with music. So to try to avoid being limited in terms of genre, and we know genres are morphine and some of that terminology is problematic in general, or, in terms of having an agreement of understanding. We're really trying to be open so individuals report to us what's meaningful to them. And one story I remember that stuck out, and was just one response that an individual kind of wrote extensively about bow tie making, and in terms of the selection of fabric and matching that for an individual's personality, but really to open it up for an individual to talk about that. I would say in that survey, I would, if I could go back and go into more depth with it, I wish we could have gone a little bit more into religious practices and how individuals understood there, and done even more around kind of culinary traditions, engagement. So those I think we felt a little shy with, or I would love to explore and do more with that. Those are the two areas I thought we are ripe for further exploration. Now I will say, depending upon what community I'm speaking with about this, there are different reactions, right? In certain ways we want to think of, or in certain contexts or conversations, there's some interest in having a stricter definition of art. Or we may think about high art, and there's different definitions there. We might think about pop, or we might think about broader culture. So there's some different reactions when we attempt to be more inclusive in terms of artistic and cultural engagements and resource allocation. But if we want to look at the broad picture and where different stakeholders in this very broad cultural ecosystem lie, we need to really understand the breadth of it, and particularly around technology, and our diversifying population within the United States.
Thank you so much. A couple of other questions that we have, and I think this one is twofold. So we can imagine how many artists that you have spoken to and that you have worked with. And I know you briefly mentioned something right now, but what has been something that stood out from the interviews that you conducted? And the second part is that, were there any issues or concerns that the artists had while they answered these questions or when they participated in the surveys?
Sure. So thank you again for the tremendous question. What has really stood out to me is the meaning, the deep, deep personal meaning that so many things that as an outsider entering someone's space, you may not see or notice or may not stand out to you as an outsider as the significance and importance of that to an individual. So in some of the field work that we did with another study in California, I mean, we literally knocked on people's doors and entered their homes, which was a tremendous experience overall. And having an older woman, if I can recall, I would say, late 60s, early 70s, speak deeply about kind of a poster of some fruit that was hanging on her wall that by broad means we may not see as, an extensive artwork or may not be judged in that manner in other contexts. But the meaning of where that print came from, why it's there, the prominence in her home and her space and the meaning around that was just absolutely tremendous. And so I use that as this as a primary example of really trying to understand other people's spaces, values, the notion of that. In this case, it was a material item, but the endeavors and processes that we need to value that really allow people to express their voices, give meaning through an artistic or creative manner, and really how do we understand that and we think about that from a policy perspective and those connections in terms of social engagement, overall health and well-being, and understanding many processes and experience that are can be very traumatic in terms of or can be in terms of individuals disconnect from home country, country of origin, trying to settle into new communities. So really trying to capture that more fully and in a manner that respects that individual's experience. So that really sticks out to me. And I talked so much, I forgot the latter portion of that question. I apologize.
No worries. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear how meaningful the work and the research has been. And I can imagine the kind of stories that you have while talking to all of these artists. The second half of the question was, have there been any issues or concerns that artists have had while participating in such surveys?
Certainly. Thank you again for repeating that. The main question is like, how are you representing me? Certainly. And oftentimes the primary consideration is I'm an outsider, right? I have a particular personal identity that may, that I need to consider when I'm entering different spaces. I'm based at a university currently, so some of those dynamics of representing a research university when entering different spaces. So I would say the primary considerations and care has really gone into kind of entering someone's space, right? And ensuring that they feel comfortable either sharing the range of what they might engage in, what it means to them, what it may mean to their family and to their community. So that notion of building trust and rapport, and that you'll be respectful and honor what they are sharing with you, and to have a real clear sharing of how that will be utilized. What are the intents and purposes behind that? So I would say those are the primary considerations that a great deal of time and care goes into.
Thank
I
you.
do have a question, and I hope that I can make it clear. Um, I currently manage the Immigrant Artists Resource Center in the program at New York Foundation for the Arts. So my contacts and my job is to advocate for immigrant artists, regardless of their, practices. So, and then thinking from, we wanted to advocate for the artists, and then, trying to get more resources. I wonder whether you can point me to any resources or any advice in terms of like numbers or research and showing that immigrant artists, like how does immigrant artists or makers are making contributions to our overall community, if that makes sense.
Certainly. What comes immediately to mind is ACTA, the Alliance for California Traditional Arts. I believe their website is ACTA Online. I will double check that. They put out a number of reports and have a tremendous amount of programs, but they put out a number of reports that speak, from my perspective, incredibly well to immigrant creators in a whole host of forms and activities, and really understanding, are they kind of being picked up in stats around workforce statistics? How and in what ways and what portion of their livelihood might be earned from that, or efforts to endeavor in that, and maybe that disconnect. I have found them as a tremendous resource in terms of the language and framing and understanding of how to better identify and be in connection with individuals who are in this space, and articulating that disconnect from some of the funding systems and kind of some of the systems that the arts world operates in. So they are spoken really well about that dimensions of that disconnect in an effort to address that. So that's an immediate source.
Thank you. Yeah, and I feel like in doing this work, one of the challenges in terms of arts funding and ecology, immigrant or minority already are underserved and receiving less resources, and at the same time being immigrant artists with potential language barrier and doesn't understand the culture well enough to navigate the system. So that if we wanted to support artists, then that means we need more resources to either doing translations and other support, and at the same time yeah, I think it's in some way like a very big question. Like I feel like, oh my God, like we need more, in some way, more resources to support the artists, but at the same time we also need to kind of express that how this artist community is contributing to American society at large in a meaningful way. So that's where I'm coming from. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you for that. One thing I want to mention that is a little bit of a different focus but related. I recently put out a study with First Peoples Fund, which is a broad professional association for Native Indigenous artists. And one of the key questions there was the notion of individuals who are great engaging in creative expression, again, kind of the disconnect from some of the funding structures that we might work within. And this is certainly not linguistic, but in terms of terminology and how individuals are defining themselves, and some of the disconnects with kind of the broader funding structures that exist, there may be some insights there that may parlay into your own work. So that might be a helpful resource.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Jennifer and Yayan. So wonderful to hear from you. And I think we may have time for just a couple of other questions. So one of the other questions that came in, what would the next steps be for potentially rephrasing the questions asked in the survey of public participation in the arts in the next few years?
Ooh, the next, well, I'll reflect on those. Actually, in kind of invited and engaged by the National Endowment for the Arts to actually build on that qualitative series of interviews conducted with immigrants here in Chicago, as well as that study that I shared in California, to actually help them revise some of their work that was implemented in 2017 and repeated in 2022. We don't have that data just yet. And some of the key changes that we made in that process were kind of a technical way to kind of like split the sample, but to ensure that we were able to maintain some of the questions, because it's important to have some trend analyses from that data from the nation overall, but how to expand and kind of flip some of the questions so that they were less genre specific and a little more form oriented in terms of music, dance, and a little more broad in terms of what they asked. So we were able to field that. We were able to add some additional questions. I believe we got one on there about food. I have to, please don't quote me on that, I have to recall, I haven't looked at that in a little while. So they were able to kind of alter some of that. Now, certainly that's beholden to all of the approvals and parameters that are necessary to field a federal survey. So we were not able to, we tried to get on as much as we could within the parameters within that, but we did change some of those specific questions. In terms of if I had my way and was able to do everything in the future, I think we need to break it up. I would love to see a more in-depth look into different communities and identities, so that we could have even more granular and nuanced language about what is meaningful to individuals. So I'd love to pair kind of our empirical basis and currency. So we're pairing, certainly we need the national stats, and I deeply value them and work with them greatly, but so we can have a more holistic picture to better have those high level stats, but also that deep understanding what's meaningful to communities and individuals, and the ways that we associate and work within communities, so that we can speak in greater detail about what the potential is, what the barriers are, so we can even hopefully make even greater investment. Because we think about this as really our community and individual well-being, which we see as well as workforce development. So I think there's even more connections in terms of even the broader domains of social policy to think about this.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And in case it's possible, it would be wonderful if you could share the names and the names of the organizations, the links that you had mentioned earlier, and maybe if you can send them through email, I can forward it to the participants. And I think maybe the final question to conclude, though you did briefly cover this as well, what has been the response or the different reactions that you have received to the surveys or to the research work that you've conducted?
I'll say generally it's positive, and there's an eagerness to do more, right? Like, how can we move more quickly to do more? I will say a number of these endeavors are extremely resource intensive and time intensive. But I think being in conversation, so that it's not a disconnect between policy and research and kind of what's happening in individuals' daily lives, but we can have that deeper engagement, so there's a knowledge exchange and an understanding of needs, so we can better ensure kind of what are we understanding empirically, investigating can have direct informational value to individuals for what is happening on the ground. So the general reaction is great, and how can we get even more quickly? So that's it. So I really appreciate that. But also there's been a great deal of uptake from thinking about what does this mean in terms of workforce, what does this mean in terms of investments into different social domains, and how do we think about this connected to do integration from a very strict kind of immigration policy perspective. So how do we think about arts and creative activity across and connected with different social domains of concern?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This has been wonderful. And I think I speak on behalf of all of the participants here that this was very illuminating. And like I said earlier, a very different perspective from what we're used to in having these conversations. So thank you so much for taking the time out, for sharing your research, for answering all of these questions, for also letting us know what arts participation really means, and kind of the expansive definition that we were earlier referring to. I think it's been wonderful, and I know I've taken a lot from this session, and I'm sure everybody else here has as well. So once again, we really appreciate your time, and thank you so, so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you. And I just dropped my email in the chat. And thank you so very much for this opportunity to speak with you all. Take care.
Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day. Take care. Thank you.